going to cut to the chase here. Thank you. Thank you, Heather. We're now recording. Good evening, and thank you for joining us for our Accountability and Action event. Speaking about charter schools tonight will be Dr. Kevin Lawrence Henry Jr. from UW. And I'm just going to start by saying that he is an assistant professor of educational leadership and policy analysis at UW Wisconsin. And I'm going to allow him to spend a couple of minutes introducing himself further and what he'd like to share with all of you. Then Kevin will do a slide presentation of further information, and then we're going to go into a little Q&A together in conversation, and we'll be monitoring the chat. So please feel free to drop your questions in there, and we'll take them as it's most prudent.
All righty, can everyone see me and hear me and all of those wonderful things? Awesome, wonderful. First off, I just want to say thank you so much for the invitation. I really want to thank Wisconsin Public Education Network for even considering me or even thinking about me to join with you all today. So I'm really, really honored, and I want to thank Jenny as well for being in communication with me and working with me over the last few weeks and the hecticness of end of the semester. And so I just want to thank you, Jenny, as well for pulling this all together. And I just want to thank all of you for joining us today. So hopefully this will be a fruitful conversation about charter schools and school choice. And a little bit about me. My name is Kevin Henry. As Jenny said, I am an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Analysis. And my work, my scholarship and teaching really focuses on, yes, go Alpha, Julie. My work focuses on school choice and school reform, and particularly looking at how anti-Blackness shows up and is operating in school policy. And so I look at things like the charter school authorization process, and I look at what life is like for students and teachers within charter schools. Particularly, my work has focused on post-Katrina New Orleans, and we can talk a little bit about that as well if you all have some questions about the New Orleans case. But really what I'm most interested in is thinking about issues of power and inequity, and also really thinking about how we might transform our schools to be sites that are really worthy of the children and the teachers that are within them, and how we might really be advocates for a public education that is robust and that is transformative. So that's the kind of short end of the work. And I will share my screen. What I plan to do, hopefully, is to kind of give some of you all a brief overview, a kind of historical glancing at school choice and thinking about the history of school choice. And so it'll be a very quick history, but if you're interested, you're always welcome to come see me at UW or even enroll in a class or something. This is not a plug for courses, but if you're interested in some of this stuff, I am teaching a course next semester on politics of education. And so oh, this is recorded, but come join us. I was going to say, I think they want you to enroll, but if you just wanted to come and join and be a part of the conversation or learn some things, you're more than welcome. And so I'm going to share my screen really quickly. Let's see. You would think after 2 years of Zooming, I would have it all figured out, but such is life. All right, so I won't be able to see you, but you probably will be able to see me and my screen. So if you can see that, just let me know with a thumbs up. And it's probably giving you the slides, the presenter slides, which is not what I want you to see, but that's okay. You all can see the screen, correct? All right, perfect. And are you all seeing the presenter notes? Yes, no, okay, that's fine. That's not fine. I want to so that you can actually see the full screen. I'm sorry. I always tell people that I'm a millennial who struggles with technology, so it's really embarrassing. So what we'll do is this. Let's try this. I'm seeing multiple things. Swap displays. All right, is this better?
Looks great.
Yes.
Great. All right, wonderful. So I want to start off just briefly with these two quotes, because part of what we're doing here, what I want to do with you all today, is to kind of look back so we can think about moving forward. And I have two kind of quotes that are framing for this. And the first one is by Michael Ventura, and it says, "Memory is not nostalgia. Memory is specific. One has a relationship to a memory, and it may be a difficult relationship because a memory always makes a demand on the present." The other quote is from Wole Soyinka, and it says, "Memory of what has been, of acts of commission or omission, of a responsibility abdicated, affects the future conduct of power in any form." And when we're thinking about school choice, I want us to think about historicizing choice and to understand that choice is not necessarily a modern phenomenon, in as much as though charter schools are entities that have come into being in the early 1990s, the idea of choice is something that one could argue is a deeply held perspective in the United States. And it's kind of central to the kind of these liberal notions of liberty and freedom. And although the logic goes that we should have choice, how we understand choice, what might be understood as unfettered choice, free from government interference, intervention, engaging in choices, ultimately, some might suggest an act towards freedom. And that is a kind of a general notion that one might have, or a general argument that one might have around choice. But I want us to kind of think a little bit differently about those ideas of choice. You see from Janelle Scott, she mentions that school choice is really an umbrella term, and we're talking about charters and vouchers and magnet programs and inter and intra district choice. And so choice is not just charter schools, although the focus of what we'll be talking about today is charter schools. I know you all have a set series on vouchers, I believe, next month. But in many ways, when we're thinking about educational choice, often that refers to a kind of reform strategy that aims to decentralize what we understand as traditional public education, while giving parents and guardians presumed options in selecting the proper educational institutions for their children. So that's, I think, the general statement that we might have for choice, but we'll get into the kind of nitty gritty of that a little bit more as we progress this afternoon or this evening. So when we also think about choice, I think we must also consider that choice is not only enacted in the kind of form of specific education policy, but also in the way that parents choose to move to, say, particular neighborhoods that have well-funded schools and beautiful facilities and certified teachers and robust curriculum and a host of extracurricular programs. Or we could think about choice as when parents are jockeying for specific teachers or classes. And so I want us to expand our notion of choice beyond just charter schools or vouchers, but also to understand that those forms of choice are really central, particularly in the Wisconsin case, but certainly, I think, more broadly conceived. So the historical aspect of choice. So this is the language around choice that we often don't talk about. And I think it's really important to think about this history. There is an idea in political science that suggests that the way something starts has a really important impact on how it ends. And so they often give this example of this notion of our keyboards that we might find on our phones or on our computers. And most of our keyboards are organized with QWERTY, QWERTY, right? And that idea of QWERTY is a decision that was made at the beginning of kind of this keyboard operation, and it is something that still stays with us today. So when we're thinking about history and when we're thinking about these notions of choice, it's really important to think about how that history has been shaped and cocooned by, or rather how the present has been shaped and cocooned by that history, and how that history may very well linger into the present. So in other words, choice hasn't, or when we historicize choice, we understand that it has an afterlife. The policy has an afterlife beyond what has existed today and what may exist in the future. So long before, say, Donald Trump and Betsy DeVos and President Obama and Duncan and the Bush administration and Secretary Spellings, the legacy of school choice is really in many ways rooted in resistance to efforts to desegregate schools after Brown. And it's really important to think about here because this is a resistance that is ultimately about resisting and refusing a world where Black people, in this instance, have full access to an education that is really worthy of those children that we're discussing. And so part of when we're thinking about school choice, and just kind of a brief moment about Brown, one of the some of the language that was in the Supreme Court opinion was this notion of with all deliberate speed. And that was used in some ways, as some have argued, to it really push back and slow down the progress to desegregate schools. And so when we're thinking about this all deliberate speed, and we're thinking about how school choice and really the resistance to desegregation comes into being, it's really important to think about the current school choice movement that we see, or moments that we see, often connects the language of school choice around the civil rights movement, and more precisely kind of links that to Dr. King. However, that in many ways is a kind of revisionist account of history, because what we see really with respect to school choice is actually, historically speaking, a resistance to desegregation, a resistance to creating educational opportunities for Black children. And what we see here is, for instance, the governor of Georgia, Herman Talmadge, created what was understood as the Talmadge Plan. And although this plan did not actually pass, it became in many ways a blueprint, that we might say, for school choice and choice programs. And so Talmadge says we can maintain separate schools regardless of the US Supreme Court by reverting to a private system, subsidizing the child rather than the political subdivision. And we might hear some of this language currently, right, around subsidizing the children, letting the money follow the child. And this really becomes really important when we're thinking about, for instance, what you will actually talk about next month, which is the voucher programs. But what we saw happening historically, particularly one case I'll use is the Prince Edward County in Virginia, was the Stanley Plan. And what we saw happening historically with respect to choice was that essentially it was a starvation of public education. And so the state repealed compulsory attendance laws, and public school education becomes a local option. And then what becomes of this is that the entire school district and system closes in 1959, a year after the Brown decision. And then what we saw happening was that tuition grants which were taxpayer funded, which is essentially a voucher, is given to white families with no equivalency to Black families, and no local taxes were assessed. And then what we began to see across the South and Mississippi, South Carolina, Louisiana, Florida, you pick your state, your southern state, were the springing up of segregation academies. So when we're thinking of school choice historically, it's important to think about how these moments that followed the Brown decision, and this idea of choice around local choices, around parent voice, right, was in many ways an effort to usurp the democratic rulings, or rather usurp the functions of democracy, and really create academies that were used to maintain and ultimately support white supremacy. So a little bit of, I'm a theory nerd, so I'm not going to really get into theory here with you all, but I'm certainly open to discussing things around neoliberalism and markets. But what's also important is when we're thinking about choices, thinking about the key architects around choice, and what were some of the ideas that they espoused with respect to school choice. And so one of those key architects is a man by the name of Milton Friedman. And part of what Milton Friedman argued was around this notion of what some have called neoliberalism. And at base, what neoliberalism is a fancy term that I use on Bascom Hill with my students and in the things that I write. But part of what neoliberalism is essentially the idea that the market, right, market forces should regulate our society, and that notions around competition in some ways might be superior to the ideas around collaboration. And so in 1955, one of the things that Friedman wrote was really a germinal essay entitled "The Role of Government in Education." And what Friedman argued, and again, notice this is all coming around the civil rights movement. This is coming around Brown versus Board of Education. So these notions around school choice can't be disentangled from an entire civil rights movement that was taking place during that time. And I think that I really want to kind of hone in on that because sometimes we lose that conversation or we lose that discussion point. But part of what Friedman would discuss was that public money should go towards creating voucher programs, which were seen as more superior programs than public education, traditional public education. And while Friedman did believe, say, vouchers could be used for-profit or nonprofit entities, and he argued, or at least thought, that this would serve the poor better than traditional public education. But part of what this is also a notion around unregulated markets with limited government intervention and interference, except for the lubrication of those markets or the deregulation of government. And so what we're seeing here is an interest in the 1950s in what we might understand are current logics around, or current arguments around school choice. And so what's really kind of telling here is that although Friedman's work didn't really gain very much traction in the 1950s, excluding the work of segregation academies, which one could say Milton Friedman kind of set some plans in place, but he wasn't a segregationist at heart. But what we began to see in the 1980s, particularly with the rise of the nation, the report, The Nation at Risk, was Milton Friedman's plans kind of expanding those notions around markets and neoliberalism, expanding and becoming a way to organize our society. And it makes, it's not lost upon me that this is also coinciding with the advent of the Reagan administration in the United States, as well as the Thatcher administration in the UK. And so part of what begins to happen at this time were scholars and activists and think tanks began to suggest that we need to reimagine schooling in the United States. And it's really, we begin to see in some ways, a expansion, or rather a reimagining of choice from kind of the left with people like Christopher Jenks, as well as Teddy Sizer, who were beginning to push vouchers, but their notion of vouchers departs from how we might understand vouchers today, as well as how vouchers were being articulated by those who might be understood as conservative, or those that Michael Apple discusses as part of a kind of conservative modernization, which we can talk a little bit about there. But part of what happens in, for instance, the Chubb and Moe argument, which are a group of political scientists who advocated for voucher programs, but they argued or made claims around private schools being superior to public education, that bureaucracy had a deleterious or negative impact or effect on school performance, and public schools, as they understood it, were one of the worst monopolies to exist. And so part of departing in many ways from Friedman's work was their idea, not in a kind of totalizing voucher program, but rather understanding competition between public and private schools as being really central to a robust democracy. And so their argument was that the market, because of its kind of self-sustaining, self-regulating powers, would be a better incubator for innovation and effectiveness in education. But here's a quote from their book, which I thought was really interesting. And it says, "The nation is experiencing a crisis in education, not because these democratic institutions have functioned perversely or improperly or unwisely, but because they have functioned quite normally. Democratic control normally produces ineffective schools." And so this is a really interesting logic, because partly they call to the floor perhaps the functioning or lack of functioning of public schools, but their logic is not understanding, it does not take into account that public schools may not be functioning to their highest capacity because of issues like poor funding, or because of large scale issues like racism or anything of that nature, but rather because of the nature of a public institution, it is poorly performing, and that it's expected to perform poorly. But also what's really interesting here and very problematic is this idea of democratic control producing ineffective schools. So in other words, democracy, as we might understand it, produces ineffective schools. And that is a really damning and incisive remark in as much as it lays the groundwork to understand that choice in some ways might be understood or articulated as linked to kind of an anti-democratic feel. And I think it's really scary when we think about that type of logic, because part of the logic then is to suggest that democracy doesn't work and that we then need to do something else. And those things are reliant on privatization and markets. So the first forms of choice that existed, or rather, excuse me, the first form of charters that existed were in Minnesota in 1991. And though there are about 7,000 charter schools and growing across the United States, and about 236 in Wisconsin, the idea of choice significantly departed from the charter schools that were started in 1991 by a group of educators. And I think that is really important to note, because even though charters exist as a kind of alternative mechanism for educating children and their initial orientation, that has shifted quite expansively and extensively, as we might see with some of the data that exists today with respect to charter schools. So Ted Cruz, for instance, in 2015 makes that link about charter schools and civil rights and suggests that school choice is really, as he says, the civil rights issue of the 21st century. However, when we began to think about some of the equity concerns that currently exist, and I'll stop so that we can actually have a conversation that currently exists, what we see across charter schools in the United States are concerns around student achievement, around discipline disparities, particularly for Black students, as well as students with disabilities, the exclusion of students with disabilities, and some administrative concerns and school governance concerns. And we can talk a little bit about all of these things, but I think those are the kind of large scale equity concerns that we might have with respect to school choice and charter schools specifically. So I'll stop here because I realize I have gone far too long, so please forgive me. But I see there's some work going on in the chat, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I think Jenny's going to kind of take it over from here.
Kevin, you're perfectly on time.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, great.
So thank you for that little historical walk. It's difficult sometimes when we hear some of our complexities of our past, like reverberating in the present. You know, we can make the same mistakes over and over again, or repackage them for a new audience and try again. I guess one of the questions that we talk about a lot in this idea of accountability and that democratic control, but like, are charter schools as they stand now, and I know it's a big umbrella right now, lots of different types of charter schools, lots of different authorizers, but like, are they fulfilling their originally intended purpose?
Yeah, that's I think in general, I would caution us to say they're not. The logic of charter schools at its kind of foundation was that one would switch the kind of traditional forms of accountability for autonomy, and that autonomy would bring about innovation and would bring about drastic and dramatic changes with respect to student achievement, particularly. But that innovation aspect, as well as the accountability aspect, I think should give us pause, in as much as many of the charter schools that we see, with particularly around student achievement, but to say nothing of school discipline disparities, we don't see very much innovation occurring. In fact, my work in post-Katrina New Orleans examines the charter school process, authorization process. And what we begin to see is that there is a a type of mimicry that occurs. So we're not seeing charter schools by and large that are engaging in play-based work or culturally relevant or responsive teaching, or a strong focus on multiculturalism, or making sure that we're attending to the needs of those that are most historically and presently made vulnerable. But what we're seeing are a kind of reproduction of KIPP and no excuses models of charter schools. So that the logic of innovation, it gets lost, I think, with what the data suggests. And this is not, I want to be clear, the data is very clear here. And I want to give this example. Often people say students of color do better academically in charter schools. In fact, there was a 2015 study that was done by Credo at Stanford. But what's interesting here is when we look at performance, so when we look at the idea of performance impact, right, what we see is that there is a 0.008 and 0.05 impact in terms of student achievement for Black and Latino students. So those numbers are less than 1.
Right.
Okay. So I want you to imagine, I have a beard. I want you to imagine me pulling one string of hair from my beard and cutting that into 100 pieces, and maybe even cutting that into even more. And that's the impact of outperformance, right? And so when we're thinking about what seems to be, these notions of innovation and rigor, we're not seeing it by and large across schools. Now, of course, there are charter schools that are outperforming, that are doing well, but then we also have to question who are the students that are being served by those schools, and what are the practices that are taking place within those schools. So prior to returning to Wisconsin, I lived in Arizona, which has possibly, I believe, the largest share of students in charter schools, largest percentage of students in charter schools in the nation, and about 20% of the students are there. The highest performing charter school, one of the highest performing charter schools in the nation, is Basis. However, when we began to look at the student demographics, as well as the particularly around race and SES, we see that there are exclusionary practices that occur in Basis. So students are higher performing, quote unquote, but we've totally left out, particularly in the Arizona context, Brown and Indigenous students, as well as African American and Black students. And so when we're thinking about what success might look like, and if we're actually living up to that, I think there is a lot of work that must be done and must continue to be done with respect to this notion of innovation, and with respect to if we're living up to charter schools. And I want to add one other thing to this, because I don't want this to also be lost with respect to the history of charter schools, which is also that in New York, there was this notion of the community control movement that was taking place in the 1970s. And part of this is linked to the call for independent Black institutions and an interest in creating some of those experimental approaches in education. And so in fact, what we saw is that the president of the teachers union actually supported the idea of charter schools, or this idea of alternative education. But that idea of alternative education that is rooted in democratic practices, that is rooted in parental voice and concern, and not a kind of hollowed out idea of parental voice, but parental voice that is about making sure that those that are most vulnerable actually have a voice in crafting a school that is interested in the children and the communities from which they hail. That is totally, I think we have a lot of work to do, and much of the scholarship has been clear about some of the concerns around, discipline disparities, around working conditions for teachers. So the labor conditions, what it means to be a teacher in a charter school. And so I think we have a lot of work to do with respect to that. And lastly, I should add, also what we're seeing, particularly in the Arizona case, which is probably what I'm increasingly becoming familiar with, although I am working on the Wisconsin case as well, is that one of the things is that the logic was that we could do more with less funding, less money at the outset. And what we're seeing is that actually that's not the case. And in fact, what we begin to, if we look into administrative salaries as well, we see a kind of bloating there, whereas students and teachers are getting the short end of the stick. So there's issues around finances, there are issues around fiduciary responsibilities, there's issues around curriculum. So in fewer words, because clearly brevity is not the soul of my wit, they're not working to what I think the initial plan was.
So what I always find interesting in these conversations is when we talk about what it is that families are seeking, or that choice or charter school proponents discuss about what their school can do, what they're offering families, is a lot of times it's exactly what everybody wants for all of their children. And I guess the question becomes like, well, do you need a charter to do those things?
Yeah.
We could just have schools that serve our children more authentically, I suppose. So as far as charters go, like, do you think anybody should even be authorizing them, and like, how would we keep authorizers accountable?
Yeah, that's great. So I will, in full transparency, share. So I'll first say that most of my work has focused on the charter school authorization process in post-Katrina New Orleans. And I became interested in charter schools because in some instances, like New Orleans, it is a totally 100% charter school district. So there are no traditional public schools that exist. But what I became interested in with respect to, I wanted to know, where do charter schools come from? How do they come into existence? And what that led me to was the authorization process. And the way that I have understood and articulated the authorization process in my work is that the authorization process is a central gatekeeping mechanism that is used to determine who will enter into charter schools, who will enter into a district, or who will enter into what might be understood as an educational market. So generally, when we understand the charter school authorization process, I think there is a logic around that. The charter school authorization process is a mechanism for accountability. And I think what we have to understand, and I'm reminded of one of my mentors, who's now retired, Michael Apple, and at the end of his book, Educating the Right Way, he discusses, or he uses this phrase, that if charter schools are to exist, then they must be a set of they must be more democratically centered, and they must center the voices of those who have been on the margins. And so I think the question for me, or perhaps a rethinking of the question, is that charter schools do exist, and they exist by and large across the United States in many states. And so as a consequence of that, I do not believe that they're going anywhere. One might be able to advocate that you disrupt them, eliminate them, but in places like New York and New Orleans, our neighbors, Chicago, Philadelphia, I don't see that happening. So with that being said, what does that mean? What do we do with them as they currently exist? And I think the authorization process is in many ways a linchpin, a really important mechanism that can be used for equity, right? And so that means that those that, and in full disclosure, that's the part that I want to get at. I do and have sat on authorization boards. So I do review charter applications. I have done that. And part of my work is to make sure that issues around equity, around racial equity particularly, but certainly around equity in all facets of that term, is central to our thinking about schooling, and are central to our thinking about the authorizing of schools. Until something else comes to exist, I think we have to make sure that the authorization process is one that is really centered on making sure that the financials of a school are in place, making sure that the curriculum and the pedagogical approaches that take place in schools are culturally relevant, or that are centered on really student learning, and not in this kind of rote memorization or teaching to the test, but thinking about how we understand learning in a broader and a deeper sense, and understanding that we need to have accountability with respect to parental voice, as well as how we might understand the governance of schools, right? And that becomes really central, because when I look at the New Orleans case, what happens is that most of the charter schools are not governed by a traditional school board, right? They are not governed by a traditional school district. They are governed by a board of directors. And part of what happens is that accountability to a democratically elected group of people does not exist. So I think to answer your question, Jenny, I think that when we're thinking about authorization, we really have to put at center issues around equity. And we have to make sure that there are mechanisms in place for redress, and that those things are actually real, and that there is something about actually revocation of a charter that does not meet the equity needs that I think are really central to the work. And so, I think, in perhaps an idealized world, that, maybe charters wouldn't exist because you can do the things that we want to do in a public school. But I think also I'm often reminded of the work of a colleague who works in Chicago, David Stovall, and he talks about this idea of the politics of desperation, and as well as a colleague who actually is a UW-Madison alum, Tom Pedroni, who did his work on voucher programs in Milwaukee, in fact. And part of what I believe both Tom Pedroni's work as well as Dave Stovall's work illuminates is that part of the challenge that we have with education broadly, whether it's public or charter, is that these systems are deeply entrenched in systems of inequality. And so whether we're thinking about, parents who say, I need my child out of a school because I need another option, many of them are desperate and hoping for something other. Now, the challenge is that something other oftentimes is not the thing that parents believe, or not the thing that people get, right? It's kind of a bait and switch, I think, that happens in many, particularly in urban districts with respect to charters. But I think, people want something else. And my fear has been that because, we've been in this pandemic for almost 2 years, or actually over 2 years, and we've not reimagined education to be something much more transformative and much more grounded in the needs of children and the needs of communities. And so my concern is that, the larger phenomenon that we have taking place is not merely a question about charter or traditional public, but it's a question about how are we dealing with issues around white supremacy, how we're dealing with issues around disinvestment in public schools, how are we dealing with a kind of narrowing of participatory democracy. Those are all things that come to bear on schooling in the United States, and those things are deeply entrenched in the politics of education. And so I think that, the short answer is the authorization process, if there is to be one, has to be deeply grounded in principles around equity, and that there needs to be some limitations set in place, as well as consequences around revocation, and as well as thinking about the larger phenomenon that shapes education, large scale and wholesale.
So Kevin, I want to come back to Louisiana and New Orleans for a second in this conversation, because I got hip to your work on your piece about locking the door before we even got the key.
Mm-hmm.
Just as a Milwaukee mom who is in the choiciest place in the state,
Yeah.
I'd come across your piece and read it, and then was thrilled that you came to UW. But when we look at that scenario now, there's an undercurrent now of sort of a pseudo public school district being created from the children who have been pushed out of the charter conglomerate, really. So there's starting to be this like parallel system to the charter, and now the public schools being accountable to those children again, and what's that going to look like. So when you look around in places where maybe there has been a revocation, or what happens in Milwaukee from time to time, like they just leave town and lock their doors. What does it look like for communities taking back that power and control, or absorbing those children, those schools back into the traditional public stream?
Yeah, that's a phenomenal question. So the New Orleans case, I often tell people that New Orleans is the canary in the mine. The notion of the canary in the mine is to help us to realize toxicity, to realize the bad, what could be poisonous to us. And the New Orleans case, unfortunately, is so damning. Although there has been conversation that New Orleans is it should be a kind of the darling child of school reform. But what we see in New Orleans certainly is that what traditionally happens is that the students, when schools are closed or there's a transfer, is that students, there's a huge disruption, first off, to the communities, all right, and to the children. And so what we began to see is that people or families are trying to find schools, trying to choose schools, but often are locked out of schools that are quote unquote high performing. And so what we see in this case, in the New Orleans case, is that it's really damned if you do, damned if you don't. I tell people the example that I often give is if I'm walking down the street and someone attempts to rob me and they say, give me your life or your wallet, certainly I get to make a choice, but those aren't choices that I actually want to make. I want my wallet and my life. And the New Orleans case is one that shows the vulnerability that children are experiencing in these charter schools, to say nothing of the experiences of teachers within these charter schools who have found that they are constrained in terms of their teaching, that they have very little voice with respect to raising concerns around issues of equity. And that in many ways, what we're seeing as well are that people are kind of opening up schools, making lots of money, and then running from the accountability that exists. But thinking about this nationally, or thinking about this more broadly, I think Chicago is probably a really good example, because what we see is that though Chicago is saturated in many ways with charter schools, what we also see is that Chicago has a really robust teachers union, and that teachers union works in tandem with the parents. So it's not merely the teachers union saying this is what we need, but it's also working with people that are also made vulnerable by systems of dispossession. In other words, these large systems that lock parents out of jobs, that lock parents out of housing, that lock parents and communities out of food access. The teachers union is working in hand with them. And so I think if we look at what's happening in Chicago, if we look at what's happening in some quarters of the New York system as well, we're seeing people are pushing back against these initiatives that ultimately, by and large, are not serving the needs of the students that they purport to serve. And so I think that there's probably, the researcher in me says that we need to, look at more examples of how people are resisting and how people are taking this up. But also the data also shows in Arizona that students that are kicked out or that are, left with holding the bag of charter schools that close in the Arizona context, find themselves right back in their neighborhood schools to begin with, right? And so I think there's a few things happening across the nation that really should inspire us. But I think with respect to the large scale dynamics of school choice, I think there are more things that should give us pause and caution.
So what I've noticed historically over time, and I'm not an academic and I don't study this, I just read a lot and get mad about lots of things and then try to find other mad people about it. But is that in many instances, larger urban, especially urban school districts around the country, instead of sort of digging in the 90s, you know, I mean, there's a lot of pressure, political pressure, funding pressure, all those things were sort of all coming to head at the same time in the early 90s. But instead of sort of pushing back and focusing in on what's best for kids, a lot of urban school districts sort of tried to respond to the charter thing by being charter-esque, right? Creating lots of magnet schools and sort of fracturing themselves further.
Yeah.
And so I never fault a family for making the choices that they're going to make, but I don't want their choices to be their wallet or the death, right? And so when we're looking at the school landscape, specifically areas that are very charter prone or saturated, how should the local school district be responding to that sort of, I mean, sometimes it's self-predatory by authorizing a bunch of it, but sometimes it's just kind of being in the mix. And I asked this question knowing there's a lot of people on this call that don't live in a large urban area, but what we've also seen is like this insidious nature of it, where it just starts to spread and it happens before people realize how far we've left the train,
Yeah.
excuse me, station.
No, that's really great. I think that what we're discussing right now, and I kind of glibly mentioned it earlier, but what we're discussing is really a larger project of what is understood as neoliberalism. And I'll kind of give you a dirty version of what that term means, which is to suggest that there are logics that suggest that markets are superior to markets and competition are superior to public education, that deregulation would allow for more innovation, and that these notions around accountability, particularly as it relates to, say, test scores or traditional, you know, these high stakes testing, is a way that we can better move and understand and create change in education policy. And those things also tie into the deprofessionalization of teaching. So with teachers having less voice and autonomy in their classrooms, with teachers also losing union rights and voice. So those things are all kind of happening large scale, big picture. And that is impacting both traditional public education. So we see happening, you know, we have to do well on the test. We have to do well on the test. We have to do well on the test. Or we're increasingly seeing in some instances, younger teachers who say, we don't even want to be a part of unions because unions are bad, right? And so some of that way of thinking is impacting, I think, schools throughout. And that's really I think a larger cultural phenomenon that speaks to how we are socialized, or people are socialized around these kind of, quite frankly, capitalist norms around competition, around accumulation, around what is seen as different and who should be different. And so all of those things at base, I think, challenge democracy and challenge how we might understand government and our governance of schools. But more to the point with your question in terms of how this kind of seeps in to districts and how districts might respond to this. I'm going to take a cop out and suggest that I won't tell districts what they should do. But what I will say is that I think districts should talk to and work with their teachers. And I think that districts should work with their parents. And I think that district leaders have to understand and work with beyond the schooling context and put forth a vision. So beyond the schooling context, in other words, to think about other institutions as well. So if we're understanding that the choice movement is actually a political movement, then we also have to think about how we mobilize and work in tandem with other movements that are challenging notions around privatization and notions around essentially markets being more superior than anything else that exists. But what I would say is I would encourage districts to put forth something that is in fact desirable. In other words, what makes choice seductive is that it feels good, it sounds good. It may not actually be good. I mean, I love pastries. Okay. And as much as I'd love to eat an entire, box of cupcakes, it tastes good for a moment until my stomach starts to hurt or, I get sick later. But my point is to suggest that it's something that it seems desirable because we have to put forth a vision. And I think the work that you all are doing is really important to uphold a vision of public education and a vision of education that says, hey, we want to do something else that may not exist currently, right? And I often think about what does this look like for the kind of least of these, and so we have to put forth, I think, or districts have to put forth a vision that says, hey, we want to make sure that we're attending to the needs of those that have been historically and presently marginalized. We want to fight for adequate funding. We need to fight for our teachers, and we need to make sure that we're working in tandem with other community groups and understanding our communities are assets. And so I think creating a vision around public education that speaks to the depth of despair that people have is really, really important. And I think that is the harder work because we're losing people because of messaging, because of how in some way, it's not just messaging, let's be clear, there's an entire funding mechanism as well as outside funding from foundations and such that undergird all of this. I don't want to just say it's like, make people get a good slogan. But it's really that I think we have to really fight for how do we imagine and reimagine education so that people say, it is the most important thing that we do for our children, and that this is in tandem with community. And so those things around, when I talk about briefly markets and neoliberalism, that is to say that we don't need to be a community. I don't have to worry about someone else's child. I don't have to think about what occurs in Kenosha, and I don't have to worry about what happens in Milwaukee. I just get to do what I want to do because it's about me. And that logic around neoliberalism is really, I think, part of what's tainting this project, because it means that we don't have to be accountable. You asked earlier about accountability. That means we don't have to be accountable to each other. We don't have to be accountable to this project of democracy, which is always a project that we're always working through and reworking and reimagining and fighting for.
So I don't know if you can see the chat right now.
No,
but Tim,
I should probably open it.
So Tim, if you scroll up to about 10 minutes ago,
Okay.
Tim Liebem asked the question, is there any value in arguing that at least part of choice is the result of public schools conforming to the standardized testing, the score-based curriculum, because engaging families and students is really messy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm reading the question, including, yep. Okay. So I think, I don't know if I would suggest that choice is the result of public schools conforming to standardized testing. I think what I would probably say historically is that because, particularly in the 1980s, education policy began to take a shift towards logics of the market, in other words, this kind of neoliberal thing, that it began to cut across public and these increasingly developing charter schools. And so I think that, for me, the big thing to kind of the fish that we have to catch is this neoliberal thing, and really understanding that as something that is really detrimental to our ideas around democracy. If we understand democracy about people participating and being able to vote, right? If you can't vote for a school board, right? You can't vote for, where's the accountability there? And so I think, and if it's like, well, it doesn't matter because I get to just send my child to wherever I get to send my child, that means that we get to totally hollow out democracy. We get to totally remove those things, those logics from it. And so all that's to say, I think standardized testing, narrow, gaunt curriculum, these are things that were kind of steadily on the move. And now we see them, they're in some ways ubiquitous, right? Public schools have to deal with them as well as charter schools. But I think the larger prevailing logic of it is very much central to neoliberalism. But what I will also add is that part of the discourse or the narrative around charter schools was, in fact, around accountability, right? Was around these ideas of improving state tests, right? Improving student scores on state testing. But that becomes, it fails, that logic fails when we look at the data. So I think that you see advocates saying, we're going to improve test scores, we're going to be more innovative, we're going to, give you the whole kit and caboodle. And so I think in some ways there are pressures for public schools to use that language or to use those reasons, right? While also knowing that those reasons are really hollow and that much of the data doesn't pan out to suggest that those advocates are actually doing those things. So it's as my aunt would say, it's 6 in one hand and half a dozen in the other. And as much as you have an entire process, a large scale political phenomenon that tries to change how we understand ourselves and each other, and what our responsibilities to each other are within a democracy, a functioning democracy. And there's also academics, we don't like these kind of either or things. And it's that there are those pressures that I think public schools begin to try to mimic because of, it's a really cyclical thing because of this larger narrative and because they're charters. And so people are kind of doing this dance without looking at the real culprit here. And so I would argue that I think Tim's question is on, and as much as I think there's some challenges that exist for public schools, because we are, people are saying we have to, do well on the state test. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying I want students to not be able to read or to be able to write or to not, that there's no levels of accountability, or that's not the argument here, right? It's that those logics often are warped. And in fact, when we're comparing public and versus charter, we're not looking at, we're not seeing significant improvement. And I think the real issue that we have is this: we just have a disinvestment in public education writ large, right? Across the board. And it really becomes insidious in some instances when we look across funding streams, as well as when we see how that funding is used within some charter districts as well.
Sure. Chris did point out that the public charter schools that are authorized under local school boards do have elected members.
That is true. I'm sorry. That is absolutely true. That is absolutely true.
But also has a whole host of otherisms that happen when we have those other schools.
Yeah. One of the challenges, I'll add, one of the challenges about charter schools is that because the state laws vary, and even within local contexts, they vary even within a state. We're talking about a lot of things at once. And so, yeah, I think thank you, Chris. You said Chris pointed that out. Thank you for pointing that out. Yes.
So Heather brought this up, and this is something we talk about too, is that the state legislature keeps finding new ways to authorize authorization loopholes. Like they reduce things, they don't increase the accountability, they work around those local control components. So we have like so many examples of schools being authorized despite local opposition or concern. So how do we correct or demand more engagement and accountability on that side of things?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think one of the ways, um, so the large thing is that we have to think about who we're electing in these legislators who are making these policies. In fact, there's a interest in, I don't know if you all have heard of this notion of micro schooling as well, which is a kind of a new iteration of school choice that may be coming to our state. We don't know yet. So I think people have to really think about this from 7,000 feet and also at a little bit closer to home. The 7,000-foot thing is that really have to be really, really central in asking folks who are running for office and who we might be voting for, what are your thoughts about this, right? And what are you, if this were to come, how are you voting, right? So being very clear about that. So doing some advocacy with respect to that. I think the challenge, however, that also exists before us is because one of the challenges with authorizing that exists is that there are mechanisms for authorized hopping. So if you don't get approved by one authorizer, if your state has multiple forms of authorizing, you go to another authorizer, right? So that's one of the challenges that I think exists with respect to the state laws that might exist on the books. The other aspect is that as much as one of the things that I write about is that with respect to authorizing, it's usually people like me or people who have started charter schools that are part of the boards that are reviewing this,
Sure.
which means that everyday people, quote unquote, not that I'm not an everyday person, but most people are not privy to those conversations, are part of that process. And so we may need to rethink, I think, how authorizing occurs and who is a part of that until there's some moratorium. So for instance, Pennsylvania recently put a moratorium on authorizing of virtual schools because what those in Pennsylvania found was that these virtual schools were so terribly underperforming that it made no sense to actually even continue with authorizing. So until there's some type of moratorium, then I think we need to rethink who's on the boards, how we then might pressure or perhaps put some, I'll say pressure, but put some pressure on legislators and lawmakers to rethink those laws. And I think that's a hard ask, but it's a necessary ask, because unless the law shifts, and I see Dean Underwood is here as well, so he's actually the expert on law here. But until we have some mechanisms in the law and policy, then it does not allow for, I think, some of the constraint that might be necessary in these cases.
Yeah, Dr. Underwood also did, she did underline that component of the distrust and abandonment of our public institutions is very troubling.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we only have about 10 minutes left. I don't see anybody really filling up the chat with a lot of questions right now. You're covering so much territory. Christian has a question. I'll call you Christian.
I was just about to type it, and then when you said the chat's not filling up, I was like, I'll just say it out loud. I just, regarding like opportunity hoarding, as we've talked a lot about over the last couple of years.
Yeah.
What about a situation where you assume the best about a charter school that exists, like an individual school, the one that you talked about in Arizona that seemed to be like producing a lot of success and a lot of joy among the students that attended it, but that it did not reach Native students and students of color. Like, that makes me uncomfortable, because there are only then some students that can access something that is great. Mm-hmm. Is there any sort of like legal or political or practical avenue that already exists for, like, how do we spread that to every public school, and so that there aren't students that are like missing out on this excellent thing, even assuming in this case like the best intentions and outcomes about a charter school rather?
Yeah, that's really tough. I have all these little aphorisms. So for good and for ill, I'm going to share that, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Um, and the challenge before us, I think, one is that there's actually legally actually no kind of right, so to speak, to quality public education, right?
Mm.
And whatever that might mean. I think your question is really important, Christian, in that when we look at what happens or what occurs with respect to sorting and selecting of certain kinds of students and certain students who have access to really the education that all children desire and all families want for their children, those things are unfortunately so far and few between. And I don't want to be pessimistic. I'm a realist, and I want us to have something more. And I think that's what we really have to fight for, something more, so that that instance does not occur. And so that we're not calling, this one school that, is doing well on these, traditional measures of achievement, success, when we see that children with disabilities are excluded, children that, or that are Black or Native or what have you, you know, that is really the challenge before us. And I think we really have to push for, again, a type of movement in education that is not singular to education. And I'm often reminded of Jean Anyon, who was a scholar who recently passed away. And she has this quote, she says, trying to reform schools without reforming the cities in which they're located is like trying to clean the air on one side of a screen door. And so what we really have to fight for, I think, is an education that is linked to education policy, it's housing policy, it's transportation policy, it's healthcare policy, it's jobs and wealth, social welfare policy. Right. So the task before us is certainly a Herculean task. And I think sometimes I often use the example of Sisyphus, who's rolling that boulder up the hill only to fall back. But, thinking about Sisyphus, if we look at the images of Sisyphus, you see that there's some strength there. The legs are broad, the arms are strong. And I think what we have to continue to do is push for education reform or education shift that is really something other than it exists currently. And while we have to fight for public education, we have to fight for a public education that is actually more robust than currently exists, because that's what people really want. All right, people want something else. And that's what we really have to not help. It's not us helping. We're all in this together, right? That's what we have to fight for. And so, my answer is kind of pessimistic in as much as I think we see that those mechanisms of schooling around sorting and creating certain opportunities for certain children exist, and that's not what we need to be fighting for. And I think that work is really the work that will continue, because the moment we think we've got it figured out, we're going to have to redo it all over again. So thank you for that question.
So Heather had put it in the chat too about the accountability on like, it's difficult to get counseling out data. It's difficult to safeguard against those things. And I guess I would just offer that in some aspects, I've also sat on a charter authorizing board for Milwaukee Public Schools, but maybe that's behooved to the people who are sitting on those authorizing spaces to compel that real, authentic compliance.
Yeah.
From their schools, right? Like if we could do something innovative, maybe it would be being honest with one another about what's going on.
Yeah, I think that counseling out is so, that's really, when I think about how insidious that is, right? My work has focused mostly on the New Orleans case, but we see this happening all over in Arizona, in New Orleans. That though there's not data, we have hard data, quote unquote. We do have anecdotal data. We do have data from parents who talk about, my work, I've spent hours upon hours talking to parents who had children in charter schools that were pushed out for a whole host of reasons, right? Whether or not it was because there was student discipline or disruption issues, or even going as far as saying that we can't serve your child because we don't have those, we aren't able to meet the needs of students with disabilities. That disability, right? That's literally against the law, right? And so there's all of that occurring. And so I think that those are things that we really have to, and I think you're absolutely right with respect to authorization. Again, those equity issues, and there's a really wonderful paper that was written by actually my colleague, former colleague, she's retired now, Julie Mead and Preston Green, that discusses how we might think about authorizing with respect to issues around equity, thinking about particularly around disability, around funding. And so I'll actually send that to you, Jenny, because it might be a really great read.
Dr. Mead is another good friend of the network as well.
Of course, I mean, you know, I just want to say ELPA, we try to, you know, this is an ELPA thing perhaps. But no, so you're absolutely right. There needs to be some significant shifts in terms of what accountability looks like, and accountability to whom, right? And under what circumstances are we really talking about accountability? And it can't just be on a test, right?
No.
So I'm sorry. So you all have to. My students usually give me like a stopper or something when I'm.
I know. I'm always drinking it all in. Okay. So I want to thank you, Kevin, so much for your time, your thought, your wisdom, your knowledge on this. It was extremely helpful for us to just get more information, more perspective, and new language on this. So appreciated. I want to thank Team Public who's here tonight, Heather, our executive director, Denise, Chris, Christian, Dr. Underwood, our president of our board, the Wisconsin Alliance of Excellent Schools. I can't share my screen again, but nobody needs to see my slide. You can donate, and you can find our resources on wisconsonnetwork.org. And we can hang out here for another minute or so and just give Dr. Kevin Henry some flowers. And thank you, everybody, for coming in tonight. And you will get some a follow-up email that'll have some of the links of the things that we discussed tonight in it, as well as ability to make a donation to support our work at the Wisconsin Public Education Network.
Jenny, thank you all so much for having me as well.